Hi everybody, we are the Ghoul Guides, this is Ghoul School, and class is now in session. This is Ghoul School, our new show in which we attempt to unravel, uncover and uncomplicate the many twists and turns of the long history of the Gothic. This show is intended to be hopefully both informative and educational and enjoyable. And for any of you who are interested in the Gothic as a mode, in history in general, and in literature, we hope this show is for you. So, for our first lesson here at Ghoul School, let's begin at the beginning. What on earth is Gothic? When we say that something is Gothic, or we suggest that reading something as Gothic is beneficial, what are we actually saying? What does Gothic mean? What does it tell us? How can it be useful for us? Now, the Gothic is a mode, a medium, a term that by this point has existed for quite some time, and it's snowballed. It is a many multifaceted, mutated monster. And to understand what it really means, we need to make our way through about 1500 years of history. So let's start in the 5th century AD. I'd like to introduce you to a Germanic tribespeople, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, who, combined together under the forces of their king Alaric, have become known throughout history as the Goths. Now, the Goths were contemporary to the late Roman Empire, and they often were pushing back against Rome, its power and its expansion. By 410 AD, the Goths had led 2 somewhat unsuccessful sieges against Rome. Whilst the Roman Empire had begun to struggle to maintain its power, the city of Rome, its very heart, had maintained itself against foreign invaders for hundreds of years. But in August of 410 AD, Alaric led the Goths against Rome, and over 3 days they laid waste to the city. This sack of Rome by the Goths signalled really the end of the Roman Empire. And over the centuries, it's become to symbol something bigger than that. Rome has been imagined by Europe for many years now to be the birthplace of human civilization, the greatest moment in human civilization, although that is, of course, extremely Eurocentric. But bear with me. Rome then symbolised culture, arts, science, democracy, progression. Human civilization in one nation and one moment in history. The Goths, as the force that brought this to an end, become regarded as the antithesis of Rome. The Goths come to symbolize everything that Rome was not, and the undoing of the progression of the Roman Empire that, to some historians, plunged Europe into the Dark Ages, which is somewhat problematic. That's a video for another time. Gothic in its first iteration then is literally a term used to either refer to these Gothic tribespeople or to this period and to what they come to represent. Goth and Gothic comes to mean barbarous, barbaric, the antithesis of Rome and therefore the antithesis of civilization. To call something Gothic is to call it uncivilized, violent, antagonistic, regressive, barbarous. We are the barbarous Goths. Those of you familiar with Shakespeare might be aware of his early play, Titus Andronicus. There's a character in that play who is Tamora, Queen of the Goths, and Tamora's presence in the home of her Roman captor, the titular Titus, wreaks havoc and violence. This is how the Goths were imagined. Now, even though this is some 1500 years ago, it's important to always keep this first meaning of the Gothic in mind. It bleeds into the medieval and by the Renaissance allows a new iteration of Gothic to take hold, but it's always at the centre and at the heart. The Gothic is barbaric.
Okay, so to recap from the previous section on Gothic origins, a bunch of German Goths sacked the city of Rome, and as a result, the term Gothic became defined by everything that Rome was not. So Gothic came to mean barbaric, violent, and uncivilized. And it's all thanks to those pesky, barbarous Goths in Germany. We're going to skip ahead quite a bit through time now to what the Gothic meant in the medieval and Renaissance periods. But I just want to pause here quickly to think for a moment about snowballs, because I actually think that snowballs are a really helpful way to think about the Gothic, particularly the Gothic as being like a monstrous Gothic snowball. And as this monstrous Gothic snowball travels through time, it picks up new meanings, new associations, and new definitions, while still retaining its foundational meanings. So let's keep those three words, barbaric, violent, and uncivilized, in mind as we fast forward and find out what our Gothic snowball picks up next. Moving away from Germanic tribes, but still staying in Europe, in the medieval period, the Gothic can be found lurking in a number of really important art forms, such as memento mori and chivalric romances, and even to the very helpfully named style of architecture known as Gothic architecture. The medieval period, or Middle Ages, spans a massive period of time from the 5th century and the fall of the Roman Empire to the late 15th century, where it merges with the Renaissance. This is obviously quite a big period. So for now, we're just going to focus on those three art forms that I mentioned. So first, let's focus on Gothic architecture, because I bet those two words immediately conjure in your mind a building, perhaps like a cathedral, maybe with tall, pointed arches, with ribbed vaults inside, flying buttresses outside, large stained glass windows, and extremely ornate decoration. Gothic architecture can be found across Europe, and examples include Notre Dame Cathedral in France, St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, and the Cathedral of Barcelona in Spain. And of course, there are also many examples in England, such as Canterbury Cathedral, York Minster, and the world famous and ever popular Salisbury Cathedral. We'll come back to this style of architecture in a moment, but for now, it's important to note its ornate and opulent detail, as well as its association, particularly in Europe, with Roman Catholicism. But for now, let's talk about memento mori. And basically, this refers to artistic depictions of death, particularly skulls, skeletons, and the personification of death himself through the Grim Reaper. So memento mori are physical reminders of death, marking the inevitability of death and often adorning tombs, crypts, and gravestones. It is both a remembrance and a celebration. And if, like me, you enjoy visiting graveyards and cathedrals, have a look around at some of the older headstones or the decoration and artwork surrounding you the next time you visit, because you are very likely to find some skulls and examples of memento mori. And of course, another important feature of memento mori is the dance macabre, or the dance of death, which depicts the dancing Grim Reaper carrying off those who have died. The dance macabre emphasizes the universality of death, as everyone, rich or poor, will die. And examples can be found in paintings and frescoes throughout this period. And finally, let's talk about chivalric romances, such as Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. First published in 1590, The Faerie Queene is an epic poem that encapsulates many features of the chivalric romance. Its heroes are knights who embark on heroic quests and epic journeys to defend Christianity and rescue damsels in distress, whilst also fighting wizards, dragons, and evil giants. And if you're thinking, that sounds very supernatural to me, you're right. Because while The Faerie Queene is a chivalric romance, it ain't exactly just a knight's tale. And this brings us to the Renaissance. So, the Renaissance is essentially a period of transition, marking the passage of time from the Middle Ages to our modern era. And crucially, it denotes a period of cultural rebirth. A new state religion, Protestantism was established through the Church of England, thus separating England from the Roman Catholic Church and also much of Catholic Europe. Meanwhile, Greco and Roman architecture was rediscovered and reclaimed. Previous styles of the medieval period were therefore seen to be outdated. And in contrast to the ornate and complex styles of Gothic architecture, simple and orderly structures such as domes, columns, and arches that imitated those of Rome and Greece were idolized. And as a result, Gothic took on a new meaning, and a meaning that masked a sneer. Gothic architecture and all things associated with it became outdated and even barbarous. Yes, there's that word again. While Renaissance architecture emulated the pinnacle of civilization and culture and epitomized good art and good taste, Gothic became synonymous with bad taste, bad art, and barbarous architecture. Roman Catholic cathedrals and, by extension, Roman Catholicism came to represent the old religion, the past, and thus also the Gothic. And this sneer further extended to the fascination with death and the supernatural. So, to recap, as well as signifying the barbaric, violent, and uncivilized, through the medieval and Renaissance periods, our monstrous Gothic snowball came to mean bad art, barbarous architecture, old religions, death, and the supernatural. And it is this monstrous Gothic snowball that will be used as the foundation for the Gothic novel.
All right then. So, if by the Renaissance the Gothic is a term used to mean bad art, to mean superstitions, and to mean something that is still barbaric and uncivilized, but now specifically in terms of arts and culture, where does that leave us by the 1700s? Now, in the 18th century, we have some key historical moments that allow a national identity to form in Britain. And this is a national identity that is informed largely by myth and legend. Britain, railing against France after the 7 Years' War, seeks to establish itself its own identity, one separated from the neoclassicism of Europe. And when we see neoclassicism, we mean the revival of the Greco-Roman styles. Britain begins to look inward and begins to romanticize itself. It begins to imagine its own ancient, glorious past. Now, how do they do that, and how does that relate to the Gothic? Now, as we learned in the last section, the Gothic becomes in the Renaissance used as a retrospective term. It is a term for the art of the medieval period, a period that featured heavily with things like chivalric romances. As Britain looks back and begins to imagine its own history, not necessarily through fact but through fiction, the Gothic becomes a tool that can be used to create a national identity that is chivalric, heroic, sensible in both meanings of the word. In the mid-18th century, a very important text is published by the Bishop Richard Hurd, and it's called Letters on Romance and Chivalry. Now, before this document was published, Hurd had been rather sceptic of the Gothic. He too believed that chivalric romances and supernatural stories were of little use to contemporary society. They were silly, superstitious, they had no real meaning, no real purpose, they were frivolous. But in Letters of Romance and Chivalry, what Hurd identifies is the crucial significance of these texts. What Hurd realises is that what he calls the Gothic romances, and this is the first time that these stories are called Gothic, what he realises is that these texts are analogy. They're not really about giants and dragons and sea serpents and magic. What they're about is contemporary anxieties. What Hurd recognises is that by writing about a knight slaying an ogre who terrifies a small village, what these texts are actually talking about is a feudal lord who misuses his power, abuses his people, and has to be put to rights. So, in the mid-1700s, we have the Gothic as analogy born. And for the first time, we have a literature that is tied to the Gothic. And both that early meaning of barbarous and civilized, and this new meaning of superstition and bad art, but the bad art being something that encompasses the macabre, the supernatural, the past, Catholic Europe, all of these things that they use that term in the Renaissance to mean, becomes attached to a literature. And in 1764, we have the publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. Now, although Walpole publishes the first issue anonymously, and he claims it to be a translation of an ancient text written in Italian, translated and discovered in the house of an ancient Scottish family, thereby crucially linking it to the Catholic European past. In the second edition, when Walpole confesses his authorship, he attaches the subtitle, A Gothic Story. And so the Gothic novel is born, and with it, the conventions that we now identify as Gothic. Chief among these, in many ways, is that analogy that Hurd recognises. In the 18th century, the Gothic novel became a popular way to discuss contemporary anxieties without taking too much risk. You have the French Revolution, the American Wars of Independence, the Revolutionary Wars, and later the Napoleonic Wars. This is a time of turmoil, of great social and political change in Europe. Is The Mysteries of Udolpho really about the 1500s in Italy and the Italian condottieri? Or is it about the domestic anxieties of Britain at war in 1794? The Gothic, in its use of the past, of the supernatural, of Catholicism, allows contemporary writers in the late 1700s to tackle these issues and to tell these tales that allow them to be processed. The Gothic's use then of the supernatural, of death, of fear and terror becomes analogy. And this is something that it is still being used for today. And that's one of our chief Gothic conventions. Another is the Gothic format. Walpole first presents Otranto as a real text. And it's not a text that's told firsthand. It's a tale that has been told to a monk who has transcribed it. It has then been translated and then been published. Metatext, unreliable narrators, these all become parts of a Gothic narrative and the Gothic frame narrative. Think about Frankenstein. That is a text that is told not from the first person, but by the ship captain who is hearing Frankenstein tell his story and then writing it in a letter to his sister. This adds layers of doubt, layers of mystique, layers of suspense that allows that terror and that wonder and that anxiety to be built. So sometimes when we call something Gothic, it may not seem so because it's not supernatural, it's not necessarily scary, but it might be Gothic in its construction. But the supernatural and terror do become two key parts of all of this. Now, be it the supernatural in its real presence, as it is in Clara Reeve's The Old English Baron and in Walpole's Otranto, or it might be the explained supernatural, which Anne Radcliffe uses in her extremely popular and still very famous novels. But in both of these cases, the supernatural either informs or allows that analogy, and it takes on a didactic element, which means it can teach. The supernatural in the Gothic often represents something very real, something that many of us will come across. Think about why you're scared when you watch horror films. But the supernatural isn't necessarily part always of the terror. For example, in Radcliffe's use of it, it's the things that real people can do that actually build the terror. But this terror itself becomes a central conceit. Terror, in the way that Radcliffe describes it, is separate from horror. Horror is something that stunts, halts, and prevents. Terror is something that expands. And terror in the Gothic becomes transformative. And this is what permits much of the Gothic that comes after it, the transformative power of terror. Terror is something that opens the mind and allows you to think on a higher level. Think about going on a roller coaster and the adrenaline rush that you feel. You know that you're probably safe and not going to die, but that fear is still there. That's what Gothic terror is. The snowball then has gathered even more meaning, and by the turn of the 18th century, the Gothic expands and explodes and takes on multiple different forms, until eventually we get to the present day, where the Gothic is many mutated things.
So, from those barbarous Goths in Germany and the bad art, barbarous Gothic architecture, and fascination with death and the supernatural in the medieval and Renaissance periods, in the 17th and 18th centuries, our monstrous Gothic snowball mutated into a literary genre, spawning the Gothic novel and the Gothic literary mode. But, like all good Gothic monsters, our Gothic snowball isn't finished. And foreshadowing later monsters like Dracula and Schwarzenegger's Terminator, the Gothic always comes back. Crucially, the Gothic as a literary mode is a literature of anxiety and terror, which means that it's constantly responding to current events, reinventing itself, and holding up a mirror to our new fears and new anxieties. Published in 1897, Bram Stoker's infamous vampire novel Dracula is an excellent example of this modernity and reinvention. Stoker takes his vampire from traditional Gothic settings of an old European castle into the present day locations of London, Essex, and Whitby. And these locations would have been all too familiar to his contemporary readers. As well as invoking fin de siècle fears and anxieties of the past returning, foreign invasion and foreign others, human degeneration, and supernatural monsters. Stoker employs the very modern technologies of the phonograph, the London Underground, and photography, to name but a few. This reinvention and continual exploitation of modern technologies for Gothic means continues throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And Orson Welles' radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, perfectly encapsulates the Gothic potentialities of new technologies such as radio. Broadcast live on the 30th of October 1938 as a Halloween special, and capitalizing on the breaking news formula, this radio broadcast sparked panic in some of its listeners, who believed that the Earth really was being invaded by Martians from space. And while some Gothic texts use technology to play with the boundaries of fiction and reality, others, such as Hammer and Universal, resurrected classic monsters onto the silver screen, and thus gave life to their own horror movie franchises. Similarly, the advent of television brought old and new screams to the new small screen right inside your house. And as radio, film, and TV returned again and again to the Gothic, these new mediums themselves were frequently at the heart of reimagining traditional Gothic tropes, such as the found documents. Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto begins with the claim that the ghost story you are about to read is actually a translation of a genuine Italian manuscript published in Naples in 1529, and has recently been found in the library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England. Likewise, the 1999 horror film The Blair Witch Project marks a pivotal new chapter of Gothic through the popularization of the found footage horror trope. Like the radio performance of The War of the Worlds, this film employs the style of a documentary film, as it purports to literally document the investigation of a local legend in Burkittsville, Maryland, about the Blair Witch. However, rather than being broadcast live, the film markets itself as found footage, or in other words, the film is the only remaining physical evidence of the three documentary filmmakers who have since mysteriously disappeared. Since the Blair Witch Project, many films have played around with this found footage trope, including Paranormal Activity, Wreck, and Cloverfield. This trope is itself often reimagined and revitalized through new technologies. as, for example, the Paz Brothers' 2015 horror film Jerusalem demonstrates. And this film is shot almost exclusively through Google Glasses, which provides the viewer with an almost eyewitness experience of the unfolding apocalyptic horror. In our current reality, we are, through technology, more connected than ever, but we are also increasingly alone and socially separated. And the recent 2020 horror film Host explores the contemporary horrors, anxieties, and terrors of the coronavirus pandemic through the terrifying medium of Zoom. The internet, it would seem, is the perfect space for Gothic hauntings and pesky, barbarous shenanigans. Although, of course, we already knew this. As the Buffy episode I, Robot, You, Jane explores, the internet contains the potential to be possessed and corrupted. And in this episode, the internet is possessed by the demon Moloch, who is eventually transformed from virtual reality and made flesh through a robotic body, but not before he causes death and destruction from his virtual home. Stepping away from this fictional construction of the internet in the Buffyverse, our own internet harbours its own Gothic monsters, as internet creations such as creepypasta take urban legends to a new realm. Playing with and even transgressing the boundaries of fiction and reality, creepypastas such as Slenderman have taken on a life of their own, flourishing online thanks to everyone who contributes to or shares the story, but also, like Moloch, spilling into and influencing the real world. These are just a few of the modern mutations of the Gothic, but it would be remiss of me not to mention Gothic gaming and its potential for interactive horror, where you are no longer a passive viewer or reader, but an active participant in the Gothic. Through its continual reinvention, resurrection, and exploitation of new technologies and new mediums, the potentialities of our monstrous Gothic snowball are, it would seem, endless.
What exactly is Gothic? Well, it's something that is barbaric, uncivilized, barbarous. It's something that is supernatural. It's something that is macabre. It's something that represents death and anxiety over death. It can be camp. It can be bad art. But at the same time, it's something that produces or makes you realize terror. A terror that is not necessarily horror, but sometimes can be. It's something that is slippery, difficult to pin down. It's something that is multi-layered in its production. It's something that uses the past as introspection to talk about the present. But perhaps most simply put, the Gothic is engagement with the other. Just as it began as a term that meant the antithesis of Rome, so the Gothic has continued to be an antithesis. With Rome, the other is the Goths themselves, the barbarians, the uncivilized, the thing that will bring about the fall of civilization. In the Renaissance, the Gothic is the past, superstition, the supernatural, a lack of science, perspective, a lack of progression. It's ritual, regression, Catholicism in many cases. In the 18th century, it becomes all of that as analogy to talk about issues in the present. In contemporary Gothic, well, it's all of that and more. This is why when we talk about the Gothic, we can talk about a text published in the 1700s alongside one published in the 2010s. When we say that something is Gothic, what we're suggesting is that it embraces the existence of the other and either promotes it or rails against it. Sometimes the other is there to cause fear, to reinforce convention, and sometimes, as with modern Gothic, it's there to encourage the reader or the viewer to embrace it, to break out. The Gothic, then, as it has snowballed through history, has taken on all of these meanings. And that's why it's so wonderful. You can use the Gothic in all of these ways, and by analysing something through the Gothic, it allows you to open a door. If the Gothic is present, why? What is the creator anxious about? What is the creator responding to? What is the other, and why is the other present? And of course, the most important question, but is it Gothic? The answer is usually yes. That has been Ghoul School. We have been the Ghoul Guides, and class is now over. Stay safe and stay spooky.